I think it is universally accepted that Pentakill 3, The Lost Chapter, was quite a success. And to be honest, after the ruination, we deserved an event purely focused on people having fun. But what's funny about it is that somehow, even though the Pentakill event, which wasn't even marked as an event in the client, was not supposed to be taken seriously, Viego's lore in the Pentakill universe became a lot more engaging than his canon lore. This may surprise a lot of you as you wonder, how much lore did you get out of the concert? With the answer being, well, not that much. The majority of the Pentakill lore came from the 3 stories which appeared on Universe, and these were what really set the stage for the Pentakill lore. But even that is not where it all started. So without further ado, let's cover the lore of the Pentakill universe from the very beginning. At the beginning of time, there was perfect silence. But that silence was broken by a group of gods called the Noisome Host. The first one to arrive was Stentorus, the Deep One, the manifestation of rage. Second arrived Cacophony, the Mad One, who turned the insanity of the cosmos into its strings. Mortals formed bands to worship these gods using music, but in doing so, their voices gathered, and in one devastating scream, a third god was born. Perpetuum, the Immortal One. Perpetuum chose those who were worthy of basking in the glory of the Noisome Host, casting the unworthy out and letting them break under the ticking of the Temporonomicon, a massive structure that kept the harmony of this world in constant motion. And so, with Perpetuum setting trends for all mortals to follow, the realms continued its cyclical saga of metal, until Pentakill arrived. This group of legendary warriors wrestled dominance from the forces of Trend. They reigned unchallenged as the chosen of the Noisome Host, acting in the names of the gods, instead of the gods themselves. There is Karthus, the Death Singer, whose ballads serve as a reminder that all things must die. Kale, the queen whose voice can rally the warhost of metal. Mordekaiser, the Titan, the master of metal, a warrior wielding a legendary axe. Sona, the savior, with the power of creation and destruction at her fingertips. Olaf, the killer, with the force to shake the foundations of the world. And lastly, Yorick, the loyal, a true devoted servant of the Noisome Host. For countless eons, Pentakill ruled, but eventually, they would face Viego, the herald of change, who would show the realms of metal a new path. And this takes us to a series of stories called the Dissonant Verses. The story begins inside the temple of the Noisome Host. Melody, a devoted stringstress, stopped playing her praetor the moment she heard someone shouting the word "fools" somewhere nearby. She carefully set aside her instrument, therefore stopped her communion with the blessed Cacophony, and went towards the entrance to find the source of this angry voice. Outside of the inner sanctum, she saw the city sprawled out before her, stone, iron and glass, wrought into brutal harmony by the chosen of the gods. Grand monoliths hung in the sky, carrying the sound of the tolling of the Temporonomicon, the rhythmic heartbeat of the world. All was in tune, all but for one angry voice. It came from a young, slender man, whose eyes burned with the fervor of belief. He stood alone. The crowds avoided him as if he was a disease. He preached about how everyone had been led astray, deceived by those who claimed sole possession of the truth. Melody looked at the rectifiers, the tall, hulking warriors clad in plate, who served as the temple's guardians. For some reason, they were not stopping this. The young man continued that Stentorus, Cacophony and Perpetuum were all true and worthy of worship. But the faith raised up in their names was built upon lies, and their champions, Pentakill, seized their thrones by the blood of their followers. The common people were nothing but slaves to them. It was the common people who kept their stale, unchanging act from collapsing. Melody flinched at the sheer heresy, the words digging into her mind. She looked around to see other devotees curse this man and call him a liar. In return, the man laughed. While everyone thought the holy books were complete, that no pages have been torn from them and hidden in fear, that all power in the universe came from the Noisome Host alone. This man believed they all had been lied to. Apparently, there was more than what they had been allowed to know. They believed the gods laid the paths before them, but there was another. Finally, the preaching was stopped by Quillmaster the Sanctifier, who wore a cloak of golden strings. He addressed the heretic by his name, Viego. With calm, measured voice, Quillmaster urged Viego to leave the temple. Perhaps he had fallen so far from the grace of Perpetuum that he was deaf to his own words. He would trouble the innocent and true believers no longer. Viego leaned forward and spat upon the ground, saying the old man no longer had a hold over him. He did not bow to his weary idols. He answered to a true power, one worthy of worship, a fourth forgotten god, the Dissonant One. The Sanctifier's expression dropped. His tone became a low rumble as he ordered Viego to leave immediately. Viego asked back, what if he refused? Quillmaster answered that he would be removed. Quillmaster then clashed his thumb and index finger together, making the small symbols bound to his fingers crash. In response to the chime, the Rectifier stepped forward as one, sworn acolytes of Stentorus. They bore mauls of flame-hardened ironwood, and their bootfalls were a percussive staccato upon the earth. Swiftly they surrounded Viego, their weapons raised and poised to strike him down. One last time, Quillmaster ordered Viego to still his forked tongue, or in the name of the Noisome Host, he would have it torn out from his mouth. But again, Viego only laughed, asking why wouldn't Pentakill come in person to stop this poison which he was spewing. They were high up in their gilded towers, fat and corrupt from the hard work of others. If they came down and told him to leave, he would have done so without incident. There was a moment of silence. Viego waited for the arrival of the Chosen Ones, but nothing happened. In the crowd, Melody was shaken by what was happening. Somehow, she couldn't find a single argument against this heresy. To question the faith was like to say that the twin suns did not blaze. Pentakill were the greatest band of all time. So why did they allow this to persist? The crowd got angrier and angrier, with violence and uncertainty soon taking over the temple, as friends turned against one another. Quillmaster quickly silenced the crowd, telling his brothers and sisters to not give in to such lies. He then faced Viego directly. He was sad to see someone fall so very far, and it pained him to send someone deeper still. But in the name of their holy faith, he loosed the honored sons of Stentorus. Immediately, the Rectifier stamped in unison, 3 sharp echoing crashes of brass, and beat Viego down. Their mauls rose and fell, again and again, and Melody had to look away, flinching at the sound of each blow. Viego's limp form was seized, dragged through the streets and pelted with insults and scraps of garbage. At the end of this abusive parade, the city gates were flung wide, and he was thrown into a crumpled heap in the dust beyond them. Melody felt Quillmaster's gentle touch on her shoulder as he tried to take her away from the brutal sight. Yet, she could not move. Horror rooted her in place. But what was worse, a new sensation crept up her spine as she watched Viego roll shakingly onto his knees outside the gates. Doubt. Viego choked on his words as he explained that they couldn't stop the storm from coming. All their lies would be swept away. Finally, as the gates drew closed, Viego rose to his feet and called out that he was a disciple of dissonance. He would show them all. Days later, Melody was once again trying to lose herself in her oasis of riffs and chords, but this time she couldn't forget Viego's words. She strummed her praetor, willing herself to let all but her heart, mind and fingers drift away. Still, the doubt remained. That's when Quillmaster approached her. Even he could hear the suffering in her play. He asked her if the other day's events still disturbed her, and Melody confessed they did. Quillmaster told her that heretics were seldom kind, They were to be pitied and helped whenever possible, but their delusions were not to be heeded. Melody replied that to her it wasn't so simple. The words rooted dread in her heart. The Sanctifier then nodded once and told Melody to walk with him. The two walked up the tallest tower of the temple. From there they saw the entire realm before them, with all the lesser temples dotting the landscape. To the east there was the Ashen Pit, a grand arena built at the site of Pentakill's original ascension. On the other side there was also the holy Temporonomicon in all its glory. Quillmaster told her to look upon everything they had built, all they had achieved. None of it was built over a single day, or even a lifetime. The first ever groups offered music to the gods, and even in their primitive ways they persevered, letting only the truth and faith sustain them. With that alone, they triumphed over their fear, and for that victory, the Noisome Host deemed them worthy of patronage. Eventually, this entire city was the outcome of that. The words of Viego were nothing in comparison. Melody thanked Quillmaster for sharing his wisdom, but Quillmaster replied that she didn't need the guidance of his words. He had heard her play. The inspiration of cacophony had blessed her bountifully. Still, Melody thanked him for his wisdom once again. As they walked back into the inner sanctums, Melody suppressed a laugh. It was silly to even think that there could be such things as lost chapters of their holy books or another god. But before she could say anything else, Quillmaster snapped at her, saying there would be no more talk of such things. Melody sank to her knees, shocked into mortified silence, clutching her Praetor for support. A silence filled the sanctum. Veiled adepts, acolytes and mystics shared glances and whispered words. All eyes were like daggers piercing Melody. Quillmaster explained that there was the Noisome Host and nothing else. Her doubts disrupted them all. Perhaps she was unworthy of the rank of the stringstress. She should pray for mercy, pray that her words would be forgiven. Melody bowed her head, cursing herself for her levity in Cacophony's name. As the Sanctifier handed Melody a small vial, he continued that she would make penance with a dozen soil. She would contemplate the majesty of the Noisome Host as she made her offering. The story then cuts to Melody, who played her Praetor so fast, her fingers were a blur over the strings. The vibrating metal stung after a while, yet relief washed over her. She finished the first solo in under an hour. It was not until midway through the fourth that the colossus on her fingers opened. Blood slickened the strings, running down the bottom edge of the Praetor's fretboard, and she was careful to catch each crimson droplet in the vial. By the end of the 12th solo, Melody squeezed her shaking hands until it was filled. She glanced down at her bloodied fingers, unable to force the beaten figure of Viego from her mind, as he had laid broken in the dust. And where once doubt lingered, anger took its place. An anger unlike any she had felt before. When she returned to the temple, the Sanctifier asked her if reason was brought back to her. With gritted teeth, she told him she prayed so. She knew the man's words were lies, for if they were true, none of them would deny them. Quillmaster growled back that the matter was concluded. Melody flinched. She tried to add something to justify her thoughts, but Quillmaster didn't let her. He saw that the penance was not enough to quiet her mind. Before, he believed that Melody was destined to rise high among the others, to become a font of holy wisdom, but now she bore only his disappointment. For that, she would be cast out of the temple, until she would come to her senses. Melody looked around and found only judgment. She knew there were those among them just like her, with questions and doubts, yet they all turned their backs. As the Sanctifier told her to leave and return when her faith had, Melody felt alone more than she ever had. Outside, Melody paced the streets with no idea where to go. Her vision blurry with tears. She ran into street performers who clumsily attempted to appease all three gods in unison, with cheap instruments. Melody ripped the veil from her face, covering it with the blood from her hands, and threw it into the gutter. She was angry. Angry at herself and the Sanctifier. And most of all, the idea that Viego's lies might not have been lies at all. Weeks later, with a soft, even rhythm, Melody swept the temple steps. Trying to ignore the heat of the two suns above, she concentrated on the even swings of her broom, content that even in this humble task, she was making music again. In the weeks she had spent wandering the city, neither the doubt nor the anger had disappeared, but she clung onto the one thing that brought her peace: music. Just like the other aspirants, she stood before the gate each day, staring into the visors of the rectifiers, until finally Melody was let in once again, to prove herself worthy of the faith. However, back inside, in secret she started searching for what she now believed truly existed: the lost chapters of the Holy Scriptures, forbidden gods. Everything played out the way Melody hoped it would. Sanctifier Quillmaster had at last relented, and he welcomed Melody back into the ranks of the faithful, though without any signs of warmth or friendship. The promising future she had once had, and the hope of one day becoming a road walker, a blessed servant who tended the sacred instruments of Pentakill, was gone forever. Editor's note: I believe the road walker is likely a reference to roadie, a member of a band who sets up the stage before performances. All Melody was now allowed to do was to clean the temple and restring the praetors of others. Her position was invisible, but that's what helped her achieve her new goals. She wiped the sweat from her brow. It was hot, but soon the suns would set, and she would have a chance to look around during the quiet hours. She would search for the lost chapters, even if... That's when Melody noticed something. She stopped, suddenly, reaching for her ears as her veins filled with ice. She realized it was not a sound that startled her, but rather its absence. It was silent, utterly silent. Melody had never heard true silence before. At first she thought she had been struck deaf, but after looking outside, she noticed the true horror at play. The Temporonomicon had stopped. Before she even had a chance to grasp at the impossibility, a shadow fell over her. A bloom of writhing darkness covered the sun and slowly crept over everything else. With it came a sound of unmaking, which replaced the ticking of the Temporonomicon with the howling of ruin, causing the titanic monoliths in the sky to crash down. Melody witnessed men and women fleeing through the streets, but it wasn't until she witnessed them being claimed by the storm that she realized she was screaming. The darkness moved like a predator, but impossibly it was a kind of song, one attuned to some terrible keening dissonance. It grew louder and louder with each new soul it claimed. Melody's throat soon went raw, cutting off her screams. She looked at the rectifier standing ready in the courtyard. They twitched and thrashed, as their armor melted on their bodies, and their staffs caught fire. They collapsed into a pool of boiling foulness and liquid metal. That's when Melody noticed a lone figure standing in the darkness at the gates. She wasn't sure if it was Viego, because this person looked different. It wasn't a lunatic in rags. This man was transcendent. Melody wondered if he was right all along, if this was the blessing of the dissonant one. Her thoughts were interrupted by Quillmaster, who ushered everyone inside the temple, but Melody stood rooted in place. She called out to Quillmaster that Viego wasn't lying. She wanted to know where was Pentakill. Quillmaster shouted back that she should hide. This was the evil of his heresy. But Melody knew better. This was a power only the divine could bestow, and it surely wasn't bestowed by one of the Noisome Host. There had to be another god. The Sanctifier just stared blankly, murmuring that Pentakill would come. That's when the structures around them started to crumble, and Melody witnessed a statue of Carthus crashing before them. She knew they wouldn't come. They have all been living a lie. There were answers, but they were hidden out of mortal fear. She pointed at the storm and shouted at Quillmaster that the answer was out there. She then started walking towards the darkness, against the surging current of fleeing men and women. Viego was out there, somewhere, doing exactly what he promised. He would show them all, open their eyes to the dissonant one. Amid all the devastation, she felt she could almost hear a word, a name, all but imperceptible in the chaos. Nutaris. Despite its horror, Melody pushed into the maw of the storm. To her, revelation was worth any price. If that ended her own existence, so be it. Somehow, impossibly, excitement welled up within her, washing away all doubt and anger as a new path appeared, dark and winding as it might be. And perhaps Viego would show her the way. While that is where the story ends, and we technically never learned what happened to Melody, we got more story from the social media. The video where a priest is trying to protect the citizens from the darkness likely happened directly after this story. Unfortunately, we don't know if the voice speaking is Quillmaster himself, but it would be really cool if it was him. And, of course, Viego's story, while he was out there in the wastelands, was explained through Twitter. There he asked others to help him on his quest to discover the Forbidden God, only ever known as the Dissonant One. And what's awesome is that the viewers could play a role of Viego's followers, and you could actually help him decipher what the Temporonomicon said. This absolutely makes sense. We know Viego wasn't the only one curious about the Forbidden God. Melody mentioned that there were others in the temple. So it was cool that Riot allowed the viewers to play a role of such acolytes. After doing it, people found out the god's real name was Mutaris. And that was the key that allowed Viego to summon the Dissonant One. But in doing so, he claimed all the power for himself, betraying all those who followed him. That part was shown in the video called Dissonance and Betrayal. That's when Mutaris arrived, Pentakill answered the call, and the two sides faced each other in a battle, which we could witness during the concert. Of course, we know that Pentakill defeated Viego at the end, in a quite hilarious way, but the real outcome was the destruction of the Temporonomicon. This structure always served as a godly force that gave the world a tempo, but now, without it, the mortals are free from the static music, and they can experience real change. That's where the story ends. What can I say? Well, one thing for sure. Man, this was way better than the Ruination. But there's one more really cool detail. In the interviews, KDA Evelyn often talked about Karthus. You can also see Pentakill's album, which is technically a sequel to this story, appear around KDA. These two are the same universe. So here we witnessed how at the beginning of time, these dark forces were the creation that would eventually turn into this. Damn it, Viego, if the Temporonomicon was never destroyed, this would have never happened.